hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay.
Because what I hear inside is not what you hear outside, and so I have to make adjustments. A testimony, for me, is not a witness. A witness describes something that I have seen, observed out there. A testimony is what I can attest to. It's something that only I can tell you about. When Chris last time talked about his testimony, it was something that only Chris could attest to and we could understand. We talk in the church, this Christian Church of Disciples, a lot about you have the right to interpret the Bible as you desire, as you understand it. But what we never do is spend time listening to how each other interprets our own experiences. And that was the joy of listening to Chris, and I missed Boyd's when he shared his. So I'm going to tell you about my experience of God. Because that's all I know. I don't know yours, I don't know anyone else's, but only as we share them can we come to understand who this God is that we as a collective body, we as a community of faith began to point to. My first experience of God happened in 1946, on June the 10th. I know very specifically because I had to call my sister to remind me when that date was. And she writes them all down. I got off of the Brown Baptist school bus that morning, coming home from Vacation Bible School. I walked into the house, and there was a whole load of neighbors and friends that were there crying. They were there comforting my mother. And yet there were others that were there comforting each other. My dad came up to me and shuffled me on into the bathroom and then into the bedroom and told me that my brother, 4 years old, had died. He had drowned in an accident in a great ditch, drainage ditch, that we all played in as kids. This was a new part of town in 46, post-war. Some construction had occurred, but not enough. There was a big drainage ditch 2 blocks over. He and a neighborhood boy had gone to play in the pipe because the pipe was so big that you could walk through it and not get your feet wet if you spread them out and walked on the sides. And evidently, as the older boy had walked through, my brother had sat on the rim of the pipe and had tumbled over into a sinkhole right at the edge of the drainage of that pipe, which had washed out. And he drowned in that dirty water. I found out later that on the way to the hospital, he threw up a lot of shell, because in that part of Texas, you covered the roads with shell, not gravel. Oyster shells were plentiful. But as I walked in, and as I have experienced my life over and over again, an awareness that it was that moment that I confronted God coming home from Vacation Bible School, the death of my brother, and the meaning of life. About 1.5 years later, the other memory I have as a child is that I was sitting out on the curb with the boy next door who was my age and the boy across the street who was a year younger and his little sister. They were playing. We were sitting on the curb that had been newly built for that area of town. And then that curb, there was a moment of clarity for me that I remember. is still so visually impacting me. At that moment, somehow in the discussion, one of the boys, who had obviously heard this from some adult, had said that my brother did not get to go to heaven because he was not saved. It was my first awareness of how important theology is. An understanding of the experience of God, because something in me just rankled me. Something in me said, wait a minute, how can you say that this innocent one is not in heaven? Well, that has stuck with me. In fact, it's still very vivid in my memory. But in that moment, in that first year of that time, in 1946 and 47, I struggled with the meaning of life in terms of God, death, and life. And I discovered having to deal with a variety of deaths, from neighborhood friends to boys that were drunk and driving on a road, and I had to do part of the service for a teenager, to the point of people dying in my churches. I've had to deal with death in a variety of ways. But every time you deal with death, you also deal with God. You don't escape that. And you had to deal with life. And what's life all about? When I grew up, the question was, are you saved, brother? That was a typical Baptist question that got put to everybody. Thank goodness when I was 12, 13, or 14, I can't remember this day. My sister didn't write it down, so I don't know. But what happened is, our family joined the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And I began to have another way of thinking about God, death, and life. Because in that church, and as you will find in most disciples, we emphasize neither were you saved in the old Baptist sense, but have you encountered Jesus Christ to begin with. And that's what we did in those Sunday schools that I attended. Mrs. Booth was there constantly encouraging us and enlightening us. But it was not really until I went to college that I was thankful that I had a chance to really discover, because I realized what happened at 5-year-old, to a 5-year-old myself, was still being played out when I chose to go into the ministry. There is a sense in which I understood God, and still do, as the determiner of destiny. We used to call it providence in theological language. But God determines something of our destiny. The question is, are we aware of it? And I intentionally focused upon trying to understand this one who was invisible, who was beyond me, who was one that I did not understand why a child should die, why war should occur, why the crucifixion occurred, who continually used death as an instrument. Why this God would not let me go? There was a sense in which God was a void, an abyss. And then there were times that God, quite frankly, was the enemy. And if you've never lived with a sense that God is your enemy, you haven't gotten intimate enough with God. Because one of the things you discover, like Job, is that God is simply there constantly struggling with us. And the image for me during that period, and still is to a certain extent, was that God and I were in a wrestling match. The story of Jacob trying to cross the creek, going to see his brother, wrestling with the angel or with God, was a dominant image for me. And Jacob was given a new name. That name was Israel, which means the one who strives with God, the one who wrestles with God, the one who fights with God, because in that fight, in that wrestling, I discovered that I lost. But in the losing, I discovered more than I would have if my little ego and my little self had actually dominated and won. Because it is in the losing to God that we discover who we are. It is in the losing to God that we discover that we, the one who is really for us. There's a passage in Philippians where he said, "And Christ did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself." He emptied the selfness in order to be God's instrument. My experience was wrestling with God, and it was played out in my family. First time I took my first wife home with me, we were engaged. We were going to tell our parents. It was my senior year in college. It was a time we were going to be married that summer. And she went to meet my family. The first thing that happened as I walked into that house was my dad and I, we grabbed each other's arm and we started tussling, and we ended up on the floor and each throwing the other person over and wrestling around. And as you know, guys who've wrestled with each other, it is a dance that we do when we wrestle with God. Because what occurs is, it's the only way that guys can actually have to put our strength up against the other one and know that the other one cares enough to wrestle with us. Now, I don't know how women do this. Except I had two wives that I fought with very well. And we did care about each other. Very much. Still do. The point being that there is a point in which you discover in dancing that the other is already present. That the God who we call the God who will be with us is already there. Had this experience many times, and Martin Buber was helpful to me in his book, I Thou, to understand this. But in this moment, the one I want to share with you that really has impacted me a great deal is I was at a conference, a Western Academy as it was called in those days. And as I went to that one, I had never been, others had gone and told me about it. And I met a friend who I had known from some years earlier but had lost track of. And she introduced me to her new husband. And Joe and I got together. He was from Texas, West Texas, which was really kind of out there, so he was kind of out there sometimes. But we got to be talking one time, I think it was about the second day. And in that conversation, we were talking about whatever it was, and Neil Diamond's music came on in the background. We had free time, and in the free time, people were milling and talking and doing all sorts of things. And in that, we began to look at each other, and all of a sudden, in that look, when you look at a person's eye, you came up and we said to each other without a word being spoken, let's dance. Joe's about as tall as I am. And all of a sudden, we grabbed each other by the wrist. Neil Diamond was blaring away, and we started moving around this room. We took 2 or 3 steps together, and then all of a sudden, somehow he remembers it as I took him and swung him. Now, I've danced with guys kind of in line dancing. But this was a time in which all of a sudden I swung him, and the next thing I knew, I was being lifted off the ground and swung around to the other side. And we turned around that whole big recreation room, swinging each other one after another into a circle, and we got through. We were exhausted, and we just laughed with each other. But in that event, I realized, as we held hands, between each other, there was a new spirit. There was a presence of God in our lives. And when I called him up yesterday to get his remembrance, he said it was like we went to a whole new level of being. It was like there was a level of intimacy with one another, and I said, and intimacy also with God. And in that moment, he said, it has still existed, because there's a moment that we can look at each other, that we need to share out of our need, the depth of who we are, and bang, we're right there. There's no having to wait. There's no having to work it up to it. There's no ever to introduce ourselves to each other. And this go-between God, this God who is with us, is right there. And that God takes us into that intimacy. That is my experience of God. And that has existed with me all along. I can tell you many other stories, but that's enough. Finally, as I've gotten older, I've discovered that getting older also means you discover God differently. And if you think that you're still dealing with God when you're 70, like you did when you were 50, you're really delusional. Because God, as I experience God, is not a God who's sitting there just cuddling us all up. God is not the fuzzy-wuzzy God that I experience. And so in turning older and being not just a senior, but of aging. And I'm willing to declare I am aging. And thank goodness. Because there was a lot of things as a kid that I would not have wanted to stay with and get stuck in. But in aging, we are the first generation who has turned over 65 in the history of humanity, that there are more of us, there are more who are living longer, and yet the issues of senior spirituality have been dealt with mostly by younger people. What I encourage us to do is to learn what it means to encounter God when we're older. There are a few studies that actually do this. There's a lot dealing with psychology and medicine and everything else, but there's very little to do with the actual spirituality of aging. A few years ago, after I was dealing with recuperating from one of my surgeries, we had a snowstorm up in the mountains, And because of that snowstorm, my daughter and my wife were not able to get up the hill. It had snowed all the way down to Auburn. I was stuck in our house up in the hills, and the snow just kept coming and coming and coming. And it actually came down to parts of Newcastle that time. And so my daughter, who was going to college, and my wife, who was working, decided not to drive up the hill because there was no way to get to our little location. And we had enough food in the pantry to last me for a good week or more. So I was sitting by the fireplace. I'd been reading that week, and a few days before I had run across a little comment from an atheist that I was reading, because it was a part of my daughter's philosophy class, and I had this person said, the experience of God is not real. It's about like having evergreen trees turn gold. And that day I was looking outside at the snow coming down, and all of a sudden it kind of stopped. The pine trees that sit outside our window, as we look over to the meadow, there were snow-covered pine trees everywhere. And all of a sudden, there was an opening in the cloud, and the sun, and I can give you all the scientific explanation, the sun came through, and 3 trees outside that window turned gold. And I thought to laugh to myself, what did atheists know, huh? I'm not putting down the atheists. What I'm talking about is how limited we are in our perception of what God is doing in our lives. And all of a sudden, those trees turned gold, and I stood there mesmerized, watching them while the fireplace crackled and the madrone snapped and popped. And as I stood there, it was like nobody else saw this, because it was like that shaft of light right there. And it was like it was speaking to me. It was coming to me. And I was caught up in that golden light. The mystics call it a sense of union with God. A sense of going so far beyond yourself. Some people want to call it an out-of-body experience. The trouble is, you always stay in your body, even with an out-of-body experience. But it is a moment in which you are beyond yourself and you perceive the world differently. And God was in that moment of transforming snow-covered trees into golden light that nobody else saw. I can attest that I saw that. And I experienced that oneness, that intimacy with the divine creator, the mystery who is beyond and behind the mystery of what it means to be a human being. That one who is beyond all that Job could complain about. That one that is beyond our pain and our suffering, and yet the one who is undergirds us, who enlivens us, who enables us, that one who we know as Father, Son, and Spirit, says to us, as he said to me, shall we dance? Because the dance with God goes on and on. And I'm at the point as I get older of saying, and on, and no regardless of death. Where's your victory, O death? Where's your sting? Goes on and on. We just don't know how to perceive it. So God continually calls us beyond ourselves, beyond our little limitations, beyond our boundaries, to discover that God is already with us, in us, and a part of this community. And discovering the God in this community is our task. Indeed. The dance goes on. And God asks us, Sierra Christian Church, shall we dance? Shall we dance?
Yes.
Yes! All right! Now let us stand to sing our hymn, Word of the Dance. It's on your screen. This is one of my most favorite songs. And thank you for making sure that it is got enough juice in it that we did dance this day. So let us stand to sing, because you can't sit down.